Long before I was a writer, I was a community arts facilitator. I moved to Belfast in September 1998, just after the Good Friday Agreement. It was quite the leap from a sheltered upbringing in conservative Ballymena to what I perceived to be the big smoke. I knew almost no one in the city. Within weeks, I'd been sucked into my first community arts projects. Within months, I was facilitating events and workshops myself. I found connection and community in the arts. I found a safe space to develop my own writing. The arts also gave me a means to understand and express both myself and the complicated corner of the world I call home. Arts engagement has been the single most transformational experience of my life. I'm not the anxious secret scribbler I was back in 1998. I have Belfast's arts community to thank and blame for that. These last few years, I've had the chance to participate in community arts projects across the world, from storytelling with Maori children to screen printing with elderly Slovenes, creative writing with Indian students, and filmmaking with Iraqi refugees. Northern Ireland has had a long and frequently problematic relationship with the arts. They're underfunded and frequently dismissed as irrelevant. Yet the last 20 years pays testament to the crucial role the arts have played in the peace and reconciliation process, bringing divided communities together, often for the first time. Arts engagement has given many Northern Irish people so-called soft skills, not least the ability to empathise with another's experience. In a country so obsessed with binaryisms, who's right, who's wrong, and which side you belong on, arts brings nuance. It deals with those liminal grey areas where there's neither an obvious right nor wrong answer. Every response is equally valid. Art is all about challenging your own perspective. Albert Camus defines it like this: the aim of art is not to legislate or reign supreme, but rather to understand first of all. Imagine for a second if this was the mantra for Northern Ireland: not to legislate or reign supreme, but rather to understand first of all. Arts engagement gently but firmly pushes participants towards this objective. Art speaks to the value of attentive listening and the right to share stories regardless of how different our perspectives might be. The Turkish writer Elif Shafak says, "When communication is broken, coexistence, inclusion and social harmony will also be damaged." In other words, if perpetuated and made routine, the feeling of being systematically unheard will slowly, gradually seal our ears and then seal our hearts. The more stories which are shared and heard in a variety of mediums, the more understanding and tolerant we become as a community. I don't believe for a second that these are soft skills. Empathy, respect, tolerance, and the freedom to speak form the bedrock of every reconciliation process. The arts sector in Northern Ireland has done hard work in our communities, literally changing hearts and minds. However, I'm fully aware that some people prefer to talk in terms of economic impact. As a community, our artists do more than their fair share of imparting hard skills. Critical thinking, public speaking, design, collaboration, and dare I say it, playfulness are all skills picked up and developed in creative settings that are invaluable to the STEM sector, which our government's so fond of. Then there's the increasingly lucrative creative sector. Northern Ireland has recently enjoyed a boom in industries like graphic design and film production. Many of the young people working in design and film cut their teeth in arts engagement projects run by organisations like Cinemagic and Young at Art. It should also be stated, quite firmly and bluntly, that the arts sector props up tourism. It's high time this relationship was properly acknowledged and funded accordingly. You can build a hotel in every corner, but if there's no live music, no theatre or galleries, what are the tourists going to do all weekend? Sit inside and watch the rain? When they do brave the drizzle, there's now street art, sculpture and installations to look at. Our artists have radically transformed the physical landscape of this country, bringing hope and beauty to what was once bomb-scarred and derelict. Back in the summer, you might have seen the news story about the train which went off the rails in Rotterdam and was suspended mid-air on the tail of a giant whale sculpture. If you require a metaphor for what the arts do and have done in Northern Ireland, the wheel and the train works perfectly. The arts sector supports the country's infrastructure. Participatory arts projects have had a marked and positive impact upon the mental health crisis we're currently facing. Older people's arts engagement combats loneliness, isolation, and even offsets the risk of hospitalisation, a tangible benefit to the NHS. Arts provisions for younger people can enhance their educational experience and long-term employability. And the PSNI can attest to the importance of community arts engagement when it comes to maintaining cross-community understanding and respect. I could go on. I could talk for days about the tangible, financial, concrete benefits of arts practice in a post-conflict society. However, even if I ticked every box on the ubiquitous post-event evaluation form and justified the financial investment to all my funders and satisfied every aspect of Section 75, I still wouldn't be able to articulate the most important role the arts have played in our journey from conflict to something approximating peace. Art has brought joy and hope and quality of life to a place and people who deserve something more than the everyday plod of being Northern Irish. The Haitian novelist Lionel Trullo clarifies why we need art in broken places. At the end of the day, both to forget the darkness and to curse the dawn, I need to laugh. A lack of art is basically a lack of joy. I and my colleagues can cite umpteen examples of how art has aided the peace and reconciliation process, fostered community and bolstered the economy, but it often feels like we're preaching to a solid brick wall. The most recent data I could find, the Arts Matter report from 2019, highlights the fact that though 85% of the population are arts participants, Northern Ireland citizens receive 1/3 less public investment in the arts than any other part of the UK or Ireland. Over the last decade, funding has been systematically slashed. If the current trend continues, the next 7 years will see further funding reductions of 72%. Arts organisations are folding, venues are closing, and arts projects which fulfil a vital role in the community are chronically underfunded and given little reassurance of their financial longevity. Let me pause here to thank the small handful of politicians who consistently turn up and advocate loudly for the arts. Your support is much appreciated. It makes the silence of the majority that more deafening. There's no one clear-cut reason for why Stormont seems so reluctant to invest in the arts sector. There are, of course, larger issues around budgets in Northern Ireland. The oftentimes fragile relationship between the parties in Westminster has led to an excess of administrative red tape, lack of long-term thinking and sustainability, and poor choices when it comes to allocating funds. Funding also falls victim to the tit-for-tat politics which sadly define much of our political landscape. Many community groups and subsidiary organisations have been impacted by governmental ineptitude, but the frequency and prevalence of this problem in the arts sector suggests some kind of bias, or at very least, chronic ignorance. Primarily, I think there's still a widespread misunderstanding of what the arts is and what it achieves. Many of our politicians don't see themselves as patrons, though arguably they've spent much of lockdown consuming arts content through books, music and TV. Save for the few frontrunners who've made an international impact, they're widely ignorant of our artists and what constitutes arts practice and engagement in this place. Participation in the arts is still seen as an elite activity associated with the more highbrow forms of creative expression. There's a chronic lack of understanding around how the arts sector impacts upon community issues, the economy and social infrastructure, all the positive aspects I've just outlined. Art is not seen as a necessary commodity, a service as vital as roads or schools. It's a fluffy add-on, a luxury, something people do for a hobby. This view is reflected in how funding is allocated. Whilst other more important services are prioritised and protected, the arts budget is being eroded with enormous implications for Northern Ireland as a whole. The cynic in me suspects this problem goes beyond ignorance. 20 years of engagement with this sector and the policymakers who shape it suggest there's a willful bias against the arts inherent within our leadership. Let me call this bias by another name. I believe that many of our key politicians are actually afraid of the arts. Some, like me, grew up in conservative religious homes where their theology wrongly instilled a suspicion or even condemnation of the arts. Some see art as little more than another wing of political expression. They apply the same sectarian energy towards silencing artists from different communities as they do to their colleagues in opposing parties. Some are simply afraid of the freedom which artists practice and inspire. History has shown that artists are usually the first to express societal change. Or, as A.L. Kennedy writes, the arts represent one of the few ways we have of communicating with our leaders, of representing ourselves in a public forum to people dangerously isolated from the consequences of their own actions. Artists have form when it comes to questioning the systems which seek to restrict them. Artists' communities are usually diverse, inclusive, liberal, and vocal. Artists provoke, challenge, and empower people to think for themselves. It doesn't take a genius to understand why our leaders might have a vested interest in seeing the arts sector starved of financial support. Anything for a quiet life. The problem is people, all people, even the durest Northern Irish soul, are inherently creative beings. Art is how we process our humanity. As the American poet Wendell Berry says, we are dependent for understanding and for consolation and hope upon what we learn of ourselves from songs and stories. That has always been so, and it will not change. Our artists aren't going to stop creating when the funding dries up. Our communities will still require an outlet to voice their experiences and frustrations, and I'd suggest art is a cheaper and less destructive outlet than alternative means of venting. This is a place steeped in artistic expression. It always has been. This won't change whether the arts are properly funded or continue to be dismissed. The frustration lies in the fact that our work as artists could be so much easier and more impactful if the policymakers acknowledged that what we do is an enormous asset rather than a liability. A small amount of arts funding goes an enormously long way. I'll continue to take every opportunity to present the case for the arts. The issue is too important to be brushed aside. Perhaps a little naively, I still hope the message will eventually get through. Today I'm going to share my own journey as an artist facilitator and a brief synopsis of how transformational arts engagement can be. I'll be focusing on community arts as opposed to a wider right to arts access through performances, exhibitions, readings and the like. It goes without saying, both are equally important. It's utterly soul-destroying to see the landscape of our venues and arts organisations increasingly decimated by funding cuts. Community art is a slippery term, but the following definition, stolen from the Tate's website, is both broad and specific enough to express the kind of activities I'll discuss. Community art is artistic activity based in a community setting, characterised by interaction or dialogue with the community. My own practice tends to be literary based and mostly centres around engagement with older people, so my examples will be chiefly drawn from writing with old folk. My artist's bio defines me as a writer and community arts facilitator. I always insist book festivals include the latter part. I value my personal writing practice and community arts work equally. As Flannery O'Connor once said, unless the novelist has gone completely out of his mind, his aim is still communication, and communication suggests talking inside a community. My writing is grounded within a specific community. Increasingly, I write about East Belfast, the place where I both live and work. This kind of immersive creative experience sometimes feels claustrophobic, but also helps lend authenticity to my writing. It allows me to indulge both my passions simultaneously. I love writing. I'm equally enthralled by community arts. I get the same buzz off listening to participants share their stories as I get from reading my own. There's little difference between the community found over post-event pints with fellow writers and the banter to be had in a nursing home sing-along when the tipple of choice is usually tea. It's never been one or the other for me. I wish to be a professional writer. I also wish to keep working in community arts. The two are inseparably linked. As my own career as a writer develops and I'm frequently on the road, it's become harder to maintain my community arts practice. Community work isn't a stepping stone for me, something to do until my real career takes off. I'm gutted that I can no longer spend as much time with my participants. In On Writing, the writer A.L. Kennedy talks movingly about how hard it was to quit her role as a prison writer, even though she understood her inability to give the participants her full attention could have a detrimental effect on their arts experience. I read this chapter a year ago and cried over Kennedy's honesty. She, like me, loved her community art practice, but struggled to reconcile it with the demands of a professional arts career. In the end, she stepped down, saying, "I had seen in ways I could never have imagined how the arts could enrich lives, alter behaviour, sing to the wider world on behalf of its practitioners, and make beauty. And I wanted that for me." I'm not as selfless as Kennedy, or maybe I don't take my own writing as seriously. I keep agreeing to community projects even when the prep and delivery eats into my writing time. It's not because I'm a nice person, driven by benevolent leanings. I enjoy the validation which comes from working with real people. There's no buzz quite like the buzz which comes from helping somebody find their voice. In the literary world, so much of my worth is bound up in strangers' assessment of my writing. The groups I facilitate accept me for who I am. They make me feel genuinely good about myself. I also crave the community. Writing is isolated and cerebral. If I didn't have my older people grounding me in company, chat, and scones, I might disappear into my own head. Camus, in his essay Create Dangerously, writes about how essential community is to the artist. Cut off from his society, he will create nothing but formal or abstract works. Thrilling as experiences, but devoid of the fecundity we associate with true art, which is called upon to unite. This is the main reason I facilitate community arts projects. I couldn't write well about my community if I wasn't constantly exposed to it. I get writing inspiration from my art projects. My stories frequently evolve from people I've met in community settings. Sammy, the ex-paramilitary in the Firestarters, is drawn from the dozens of older men I've met in workshops. Many of the postcard stories are, with full permission, based upon stories I've been told during sessions. I'm grateful for them all. I can bear witness to how community arts practice has benefited me as an emerging artist, not least in the secondary income it's provided, often supplementing paltry book advances and royalty checks. I can and will cite dozens of examples of participants impacted by a facilitated engagement with the arts. For many, this experience was a new one, and it's worth remembering that in a country which is traditionally focused upon work and family responsibility, a huge number of people only come to the arts post-retirement. I suspect there are numerous talented artists, undiscovered Heaney's and Morrisons, who've simply never had the opportunity to discover their gifts. I've occasionally stumbled upon a first-time writer who's knocked me sideways. If these artists remain unknown because of underfunding or legislative bias, it'll be a loss to us all. On both an individual and societal level, community arts have had an incredibly positive impact on the changing landscape of Northern Ireland. It's a chronic understatement to say these impacts do not garner the attention they deserve. I propose to conclude on a celebratory note. Here are 8 ways community arts engagement uniquely serves and enhances the lives of Northern Irish people. I hope this list serves as a challenge to our policymakers and funders. I also hope it reads as a loud, well done to all the hardworking and underfunded, enthusiastic and visionary artists I've met along the way. You are nothing short of inspirational. If it was up to me, I'd give you all £1 million. 1. Art creates liminal spaces. Most of us who've grown up in Northern Ireland are accustomed to binary thinking. It's forced upon us when we fill in monitoring forms. You have to pick one side or the other. We're constantly reminded of difference rather than similarity. We live with an inherent philosophy of separatism, or as Maria Popova puts it, we spend our lives trying to discern where we end and the rest of the world begins. We're encouraged to define ourselves by how we are not the other, and in doing so often struggle to understand the other's perspective and experience. Our history reminds us that this polarised way of thinking about identity breeds distrust, sectarianism, and violence. Art is rarely interested in fixed ideas. Art blurs the lines, resists definition, and flourishes in those liminal spaces where it's possible to question, challenge, and reinterpret. Art allows us to be various, maintaining multiple identities at one. It usefully suspends our great and violent desire to be in the right on every question and creates an unholy and ungovernable mix of the true and false, writes Sadie Smith. The arts have given many people in Northern Ireland a tool to use when approaching potentially problematic conversations, such as the Decade of Centenaries commemorations. Where no single version of our complex history could be agreed upon, arts allowed us to create theatre, music and visual art which draws upon composite ideas yet feels fresh and relevant. At best, this response is neither binary nor blandly homogenous. It's new and vital. It belongs equally to all who've contributed. Art allows us to temporarily step outside our own fixed ideas of self and belief, engaging with the other in a non-confrontational way. I often ask my workshop participants to write a piece from the perspective of someone from a different background. I'm not asking them to agree with or validate this experience. I just want them to be somebody else for half an hour, and in this moment understand that their own experience is not the only one which exists. This exercise almost always results in great conversations about how identity is more nuanced than we've been led to believe. Conversations like this and the gradual change in mindset they often lead to pave the way for a tolerant and more peaceful future. Art does this by default. It can't stop itself from encouraging people to think outside the box. 2. Art fosters empathy. For the previous 2 years, I've been part of an Irish Writers' Centre residency in the Falls and Shankill Women's Centres. Every Wednesday morning for weeks on end, we've met over tea and tray bakes on one side or other of the peace line. These were women from very different backgrounds who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have gathered together in the same room. The first few weeks, I kept the writing exercises purposefully neutral. We wrote about food, music, grandchildren, building up trust, finding connections, learning how to laugh together. As the project progressed, the writing exercises nudged the women out of their comfort zones. They shared stories from their own cultural backgrounds. They listened respectfully and asked genuine questions. They were not only open to learning from each other, they were actively looking for similarities between each other's experiences. So one woman's story about naming her child after the Pope led to an open discussion about where names came from and the way names take on a particular resonance here in Northern Ireland. Another woman's story about her sense of belonging that she finds in her Orange Lodge became a great conversation about place, community, and what home means. The American short story writer George Saunders claims that the best stories proceed from a mysterious truth. They make us more humble, cause us to empathise with people we don't know, because they help us imagine these people. And when we imagine them, if the storytelling is good enough, we imagine them as being essentially like us. The women in my creative writing group created a safe and welcoming space in which to tell their stories, and though they were expressing very different outlooks, could see themselves in the other. They could empathise enough to understand their commonality far outweighed any imposed difference. When we published a pamphlet of the group's writing, it included a poem they'd collaborated on. You can hear both their individual voices and a sense of communal identity in these lines. We are women who are not afraid to say it as it is. We are individuals and have our own identities. We are never done talking. We're a great bunch of women. We're stuck together and stronger for it. Art allows us to temporarily inhabit the other's experience. And once you've empathised with a person, which is to say you've recognised some part of yourself in them, it is much more difficult to dismiss that person, to hate, to castigate or brutalise. 3. Art brings people together. The American writer and civil rights activist Audre Lorde insists that we do not hide behind the mockeries of separation that have been imposed upon us and which so often we accept as our own. The history of Northern Ireland is one of separation, segregation, and consequently mutual distrust. However, community art plays an integral role in the reconciliation process by bringing people together who wouldn't normally meet. The arts are categorised by diversity and inclusion. Our community arts projects don't just straddle the traditional sectarian divide funders seem so focused upon, they also reflect the increasingly diverse gender, class, ethnic and sexual identities which constitute contemporary Northern Ireland. As a side note, the recent move to online workshops necessitated by the pandemic has had some unexpected benefits. I suspect the online space must be more neutral than any physical space in the north because my workshops have been attended by the most diverse group I've worked with in 20 years. In a cross-community arts project, participants with little in common can find commonality in a shared activity. On other occasions, politics and personal bias are trumped by the realisation that the project has gathered disparate individuals around a more important issue or goal. I'm thinking here of the 2 precious years I spent co-facilitating an Alzheimer's Society group called Singing for the Brain. The 50-odd members who attended weekly came from a wide variety of backgrounds, yet set their differences aside, united by their shared experience of battling dementia and their desire to sing and enjoy themselves. When I think of all those dear faces circled round the piano, belting out Molly Malone and Show Me the Way to Go Home, I'm reminded of Toni Morrison's bold and beautiful mantra, I refuse the prison of I and choose the open space of we. I'm also reminded of a reading to celebrate the John Hewitt Society's Once Alien Here project. A participant from a fellow writers group shared a poem about the Swedish shop near his childhood home in West Belfast. As soon as the reading concluded, he was approached by a woman from my writing group who not only recognised the Swedish shop she'd frequented as a child, but also the man himself. He was the little boy she'd once played with. She'd not clapped eyes on him since the peace walls descended, severing their street in two. Art reunited these 2 old friends, and their lives were richer for it. I could reel off a dozen other similar stories lifted from my own life as well as those of participants. These strange and powerful connections don't happen unless we contend for them, creating spaces where strangers can come together and comfortably share. 4. Art values every story. Older people's arts projects often involve reminiscence work. We share stories and write about the past. I've lost track of how many times a story's been recounted, sometimes with laughter, more frequently with tears, then immediately followed by the confession, that's the first time I've ever talked about that. I can't recall a single occasion where the storytellers regretted sharing. There's a tremendous relief in releasing something painful or precious into a space where you feel supported and listened to. It validates your experience. Sometimes it's even the first step towards healing. As the poet Maya Angelou wrote, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. And Northern Ireland is rife with difficult, sometimes horrific untold stories. Many people live under the weight of what's never been said. Not to be able to tell your story is to be silenced and shut out. Therefore, it is to be dehumanised, claims Elif Shafak. She's absolutely right. A huge number of people in Northern Ireland have been systematically silenced for various reasons. We continue to live with the consequences. If we're to progress through the next period of difficult conversations about our country's future, it's essential that every voice is listened to. Not just those who are shouting the loudest or those who fit the perceived notion of Northern Irish identity. Art provides a creative outlet for all our stories, both the untold and the achingly familiar. These stories, when shared, can combat ignorance and fear. Sometimes a person is silenced by others. Sometimes a person silences themselves. There are traumas and fears so terrible they're hard to speak of. Fears keeps others from speaking up. The legacy of whatever you say nothing is still viciously apparent in this place. However, the positive impact of sharing difficult stories through music, poetry, or even dance is well documented. Arts engagement can be cathartic. It releases stress, it encourages peer support and validation. It provides a safe outlet for many people who are struggling with mental health issues. Art projects make room for isolated people who need to be heard. About 10 years ago, I was facilitating a series of single identity writing workshops with women in North Belfast. They wanted to write about their experience of the Troubles. The sessions quickly descended into who could tell the most horrific anecdote. Every evening, I'd cry in the car on the way home, desperately upset by what I'd heard, yet I could see the stories were having little impact on the tellers. They'd been recounted so many times the women weren't really hearing what they said anymore. In pausing and intentionally listening to each of these stories as we shaped them into poems, I began to notice a change in the women. They were thinking about their stories differently, considering the implications, letting their emotions catch up. It was such a powerful experience watching these women reconnect with their own stories. Art's a mysterious sort of thing. It sneaks up and changes us when we least expect it. I constantly have to remind myself and the funders that a project's end product is never the goal. We think through making. We only fully understand our stories as we're telling and singing and writing them. Or as the American writer Verlin Klinkenberg says, you have no idea what you're going to say until you discover what you want to say as you make the sentences that say it. There are so many people in Northern Ireland who are still working out what they need to say. We can't afford to lose their stories. Each one's a part of us. 5. Art Instills Confidence. A few years ago, I ran a community arts project where long-term carers could write and record a radio drama about their experience. 2 ladies who had no prior experience of creative writing appeared at the first session. They kept their anoraks on for the full 2 hours. They didn't know if they were going to stay. 6 weeks later, when we recorded our dramas, these 2 ladies were the first in line to step up to the mic. Something magical had happened in the interim. A combination of their own tenacity and the encouragement of other participants, attentive support from professional artists, and a lot of custard creams had brought out their confidence. I've seen it happen so many times. Those participants who are most shy and reticent at first, who doubt their own capability and can't find their voice, end up being the stars of the show. For facilitators like me, there's nothing as moving or validating as watching these people at their end of project celebration. I always try to coax my participants out of their comfort zone, encouraging them to make something really excellent. So when they see their work in a gallery or on screen or print it for others to read, they're shocked by just how brilliant it is. I love seeing my participants proud of their work because I know this confidence will extend beyond our workshops. It will impact their very idea of themselves and what they're capable of. I get angry when community arts engagement is seen as hobbyism or even glorified babysitting. To positively change a person's perception of themselves is a radical and powerful thing. Many participants leave these projects actively dreaming about changes they'd like to make, both in their lives and their communities. And as Toni Morrison says, dreaming's not irresponsible. It is first-order human business. It is not entertainment, it is work. When Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream," he was not playing, he was serious. Societal change, and nobody's arguing that Northern Ireland couldn't do with a dose of that, begins with individuals who feel empowered and confident. 6. Art teaches us how to disagree well. The QFT taught me I was wrong. I hadn't experienced world cinema until I arrived in Belfast in 1998. I grew up in Ballymena in the 80s in a Presbyterian community where teaching was didactic and often delivered in a loud, angry voice. I didn't know there was a better way to debate, to express your opinion or even disagree. I'm reminded of Lyra McKee's wise words on how we engage with people who think differently from us. The one thing I've learned is that you can't shift people from their positions by shouting at them. I've tried, does not work. As I sat in the QFT every week, witnessing experiences and stories radically different from my own, I began to challenge my own inherited ways of thinking. No one was shouting at me, no one was telling me I was wrong. I felt safe in this space and grateful to sit with others' experiences, working out what I believed and where I was wrong. Rarely do people instantly change their minds when it comes to deeply held beliefs or prejudices. In her novel Flights, Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk talks of learning by layers, each layer only vaguely reminiscent of the previous. Usually it's a variation, a modified version, each contributing to the order of the whole. Any radical change of outlook requires a mental and emotional journey, tweaking and challenging learned behaviours and bias. You can't argue someone into changing a fundamental part of themselves. They may claim to be transformed, but they'll only be paying lip service to the change. When you consider this in the context of how we've traditionally employed rhetoric here in Northern Ireland, gouldering at each other from a great distance, it's pretty obvious why so many harmful ways of thinking have lingered for so long. Community arts projects can begin to undo years of harmful practice. They encourage participants to be together in their difference, listening carefully to other perspectives, expressing their criticism or questions respectfully and creatively. Back in my youth, I was part of a Presbyterian-run peace initiative. We were partnered up with Catholic students. Sitting on opposite sides of a community centre, we were instructed to list all the negative tropes associated with each other's communities. It wasn't helpful. They did not change hearts or minds. It stands in stark contrast to my experience facilitating a women's writing project in Turf Lodge a few years back. 4 weeks in, over jammy pancakes and tea, the ladies began asking me questions about growing up Protestant. There was a lot of laughter. I didn't mind. They weren't mocking my tradition. They were genuinely surprised by some of the strange things we did. And seeing Presbyterianism through their eyes, I could understand their incredulity. Arts engagement teaches us how to be objective. As well as showing us how to find common ground, it allows us to sit comfortably in our difference. It gives us the tools we need to disagree well and the space to journey through personal change. 7. Art allows us to celebrate and interrogate our past. We hunger for a way to articulate who we are and what we mean, writes Toni Morrison. Here in this part of the world, we've been struggling and frequently failing to articulate our history for centuries. Every time a friend comes to visit, they inevitably ask if there's a museum about the Troubles, and I have to explain it's complicated. Everybody has a different version of what happened here. Maria Popova writes, history is not what happened, but what survives the shipwrecks of judgment and chance. And arguably, the artists have had a slightly easier and more successful time trying to capture and understand our past. Our history is so current, so changeable and various, it cannot be reduced down to a single simple narrative. Art is wide and objective enough to let us simultaneously celebrate and interrogate the complex histories we've lived through. The writer and human rights activist Valeria Luiselli claims these problematic, disputed stories must be told because before anything can be understood, it has to be narrated many times in many different words and from many different angles by many different minds. I've seen this played out in community arts projects which address issues like the Troubles and the Decade of Centenaries. The more diverse voices and perspectives which are included, the closer we come to understanding what actually happened, what was perceived to have happened, and how the repercussions were felt widely and variously. Even in seemingly non-contentious projects like a recent commission celebrating the history of Belfast Botanic Gardens, including multiple narratives, gardeners, local residents, school children, community groups, and adults with learning difficulties in the final mural, made for what felt like an inclusive and comprehensive portrayal of this special place. It does not surprise me that community arts engagements has been integral to the peace and reconciliation process. It's given many people skills and opportunities to celebrate and interrogate their past in an empowering yet non-threatening way. Sadly, the funding does not reflect just how vital this work is. Finally, 8. Art helps us to move forward. Engaging with art in any form, be it visiting a gallery, listening to a radio play, or joining a watercolour class at your local community centre, involves moving beyond yourself. Whether you're writing a novel or reading a novel or discussing one in a book group, you're unconsciously saying your own experience is not enough. You're interested in what else is out there. This is an infinitely healthy thing. Art has a clear trajectory. It is rarely stationary. It's always thinking, always questioning, always morphing and evolving. Participants in community arts projects inevitably get swept up in this same journey, enjoying new experiences, recalibrating their thinking, becoming slowly more confident. Art helps us to progress as individuals. It helps us to face our fears and challenge ourselves. After coordinating the dementia-friendly screenings at the QFT for 2 years, I began to notice a number of our Saturday morning attendees coming along to regular screenings. They'd previously been intimidated by the idea of art house cinema, but having met the staff and grown used to the building during the dementia screenings, they now felt comfortable attending all sorts of films. We who live and breathe art often forget how intimidating a theatre or gallery can seem to someone with no prior experience. It would be naive not to acknowledge the detrimental impact of classist thinking here. Many of my participants who come from working class backgrounds have expressed a sentiment, this kind of place or thing isn't for the likes of us. A community arts project well delivered should emphasise the truth that everyone is entitled to art. It should encourage new interests in participants and provide a gateway into other artistic experiences. If we don't seriously invest in developing audiences through engagement work in the community, our theatres, galleries and concert halls will soon be sitting half empty or perhaps even full. The idea that art can help us move forward is particularly important here in the North, where our politics, religion and general outlook often feels like it's stuck in the past or at best endlessly treading water. We talk about a better future, but we've no real idea how to get there. The Haitian writer Edwidge Danticat says, "I am even more certain that to create dangerously is also to create fearlessly, boldly embracing the public and private terrors that would silence us, then bravely moving forward even when it feels as though we are chasing or being chased by ghosts." When Danticat talks of creating dangerously, she could be describing any one of the hundreds of community arts projects which take place every week across Northern Ireland. Boldly embracing the public and private terrors that would silence us, helping disparate communities connect and find aspects of solidarity, giving voice to untold stories, providing a framework for progress so that this country and the various people who call it home can move bravely forwards, imagining a future which is not only better, but characterised by creativity. I've outlined 8 ways in which community arts have a unique and positive impact upon Northern Ireland. Some can be measured in the ubiquitous evaluation form. Some impacts are harder to quantify. They slip between the lines but are no less tangible or significant. It's hard to measure things like confidence, belonging, or hope. Yet a lack of these fundamental rights has contributed to some of the biggest problems Northern Ireland faces today. It's high time we stop seeing community arts provision as either a periphery issue or something which is only worthwhile if it can prove its economic impact. It can, and it has, and it could do more if funders had a little more confidence in the sector, but this isn't the point I want to leave you with. I believe that everyone deserves access to the arts, not because this place is broken and art's a way of mending it, but because creativity is a basic human right. And I know no better way of navigating the mess and muddle of modern life. Good art stops being art, writes A.L. Kennedy. It becomes a way of being happy, of receiving something beautiful and human from strangers, of exploring one's identity, of being not alone. 2 years ago, I worked with 3 different community groups to create a soundscape for the Palm House in Botanic Gardens. In the week between recording the participants' voices and launching the installation, one of our older contributors sadly passed away. Her funeral took place on the morning of our launch event. We asked the group she belonged to if they'd like to postpone the celebration. "Absolutely not," they said. They came straight to the Palm House from the funeral. We listened to the recording of our friend. We took a few moments to remember her. There were some tears. Then there was music and laughter and memory sharing. We ended up dancing round the room singing "When the Saints Go Marching In." Participants from all 3 groups joined in as we celebrated this woman's life. In the sadness, there was joy. In the loneliness, there was community. In the loss, there was hope and beauty and humanity. When I'm asked what community arts can achieve in a place as complex and broken as Northern Ireland, I always think of that afternoon. I'd like to thank the Imagine Festival in Belfast for having me today.